The ancient halls of the Galactic Council echoed with whispers older than most civilizations. Elder Vorthax weathered claws scraped against the crystalline floor as he made his way to the central chamber, each step carrying the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom. The emergency session had been called with unprecedented urgency, and the tremor in his voice when he spoke to the assembled representatives revealed just how serious the situation had become. "Children of the stars," Vorthak began, his multiple eyes scanning the diverse array of species gathered before him. "We face a crisis that threatens everything we have built over the millennia. The humans have been contacted." A collective shudder rippled through the chamber. Representatives from 100 different worlds shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some species' natural bioluminescence flickering with anxiety. The Zelthani ambassador's tentacles coiled tighter around her speaking staff, while the crystalline Korvaths resonated with low, nervous harmonics that filled the air with an ominous hum. Vorthak's ancient voice continued, heavy with the burden of terrible knowledge. "For those too young to remember the stories, for those who think our warnings are merely the rambling of old fools, let me remind you why the name of humanity strikes fear into the hearts of those wise enough to remember." The holographic display in the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing images of peaceful worlds, bustling trade routes, and thriving civilizations. Then the images shifted, showing the same worlds reduced to ash and rubble, their populations scattered to the cosmic winds. 12,000 standard cycles ago, when many of your species were still discovering fire, humanity existed in a sector we now call the Forbidden Zone. They were not like us. They were not civilized. They were predators in the truest sense, evolved from creatures that hunted in packs, that killed for survival, that knew no mercy when threatened. Elder Zephes, the ethereal representative from the singing worlds, spoke in harmonious tones that translated as deep concern. "But surely, honored elder, they were contained. Surely the ancient protocols worked." Vorthak's laugh was bitter like the sound of dying stars. "Contained? Child, you understand nothing. We tried to contain them. We tried to negotiate with them. We tried to civilize them. Every attempt ended in disaster." The holographic display showed ships unlike anything in current galactic design, angular, aggressive vessels that looked more like weapons than transportation. They bore the markings of various human factions, each one representing a different approach to the problem of existing in a hostile universe. The humans had something we had never encountered before in all our explorations of the galaxy. They called it spite. When cornered, when outnumbered, when facing certain extinction, they did not surrender. They did not negotiate. They became more dangerous. Ambassador Kleck of the Hive Minds clicked his mandibles nervously. Surely, their technology was primitive compared to the combined might of the ancient alliance. "Technology?" Vorthak's eyes glowed with the memory of horrors witnessed long ago. "They took our technology and improved it. They studied our weapons and made them deadlier. They learned our tactics and turned them against us. But worse than all of that, they had something we could never replicate or understand. They had the ability to hate with such intensity that it became a weapon in itself." The chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the nervous breathing of 100 different species. Everyone present knew the stories, but hearing them from one who had lived through those dark times made them real in a way that historical records could never achieve. "I was there," Vorthak continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was a young warrior when the Coalition made the decision to end the human threat once and for all. We assembled the greatest fleet in galactic history. Ships from 1,000 worlds, weapons that could crack planets, shields that had never been breached. We were certain that this time we would succeed where others had failed." The holographic display showed the massive fleet, stretching across light years of space, an armada so vast that it blocked out entire star systems. Ships of every conceivable design and function moved in perfect formation, their combined firepower capable of sterilizing entire sectors of the galaxy. The humans knew we were coming. They had always known this day would arrive, and they were ready. Images flickered across the display showing human worlds, but these were not the pastoral, peaceful planets most species called home. These were fortress worlds, every surface covered with defensive installations, every moon turned into a weapon platform, every asteroid belt converted into a minefield of automated defenses. The first engagement lasted 3 days. We lost more ships in those 3 days than in the previous 1,000 years of galactic conflict combined. The humans fought like cornered beasts, but worse. They fought like cornered beasts with the intelligence to anticipate our every move. Vorthak paused, his ancient frame trembling with the memory. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came when we realized that they were not fighting to win. They were fighting to make sure that if they fell, we would fall with them. The display showed human ships ramming into coalition vessels, their crews singing battle hymns as they died. It showed human colonies activating planet-killing devices rather than allowing their worlds to be conquered. It showed human children, barely old enough to understand what was happening, manning defensive positions with the grim determination of seasoned warriors. They called it the Scorched Galaxy Doctrine, Vorthak explained. If humanity was to be exterminated, they would ensure that the galaxy itself burned with them. They began systematically destroying everything they had built, denying us any victory, any prize, any hope that their defeat would benefit us. Representative Thys of the ocean world spoke in burbling tones of confusion. But surely reason could have prevailed. Surely some compromise could have been reached. You still do not understand, Vorthak said, his voice filled with something approaching pity. We sent our greatest diplomats, our most persuasive speakers, our wisest philosophers. The humans listened politely to every offer, every proposal for peace. Then they made a counteroffer. The chamber waited in tense silence. Total unconditional surrender, not of them to us, but of us to them. Complete submission to human authority across the entire galaxy. Every species, every world, every individual life to be subject to human judgment and human law. Shocked gasps echoed through the chamber. Several representatives began speaking at once, their translations overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and outrage. When we refused, Vorthak continued, when we pointed out the absolute insanity of such a demand, the human negotiator smiled. I will never forget that smile. It was not cruel or mocking, it was sad. And he said words that still echo in my nightmares. Then you have chosen extinction, not just for us, but for everyone. The holographic display showed the final phase of the war. Human ships were no longer trying to defend their territory. Instead, they were spreading across the galaxy like a plague, targeting not just coalition military assets but civilian populations, trade routes, and the basic infrastructure that held galactic civilization together. They kept their word, Vorthak said quietly. They began methodically destroying everything that made galactic civilization possible. Trade routes were severed. Communication networks were shattered. Entire species found themselves cut off from the rest of the galaxy, left to survive on their own or die in isolation. The images showed worlds going dark, one by one, as human raiders eliminated power stations, destroyed orbital habitats, and left behind only darkness and silence. What made it even more terrifying was the systematic nature of it all. This was not random destruction born of rage, but calculated annihilation executed with scientific precision. The humans had studied us for generations. They knew our weaknesses, our dependencies, our fears. They knew exactly what to target to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. And they shared this knowledge freely among themselves, turning every human into a potential weapon of mass destruction. Elder Kravas of the machine worlds processed this information with mechanical precision. What ended the war? How were they finally stopped? Vorthak's expression grew even more grim. They were not stopped, they chose to stop themselves. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs. How could a species bent on galactic destruction simply choose to cease their campaign of annihilation? After 2 years of watching civilization collapse around us, after seeing entire sectors of the galaxy reduced to pre-spaceflight barbarism, we received a message broadcast on every frequency, in every language, from every human ship simultaneously. The display showed a simple text message, but its implications were staggering. The message was brief: have you learned your lesson yet? The significance of those words hit the assembled representatives like a physical blow. The humans had not been trying to win a war, they had been teaching a lesson. The systematic destruction, the careful targeting of infrastructure, the precise application of force, all of it had been designed to demonstrate just how fragile galactic civilization really was. We realized then that we had never understood what we were fighting. We thought the humans were a primitive species that could be controlled or eliminated like any other threat. Instead, we discovered that they were teachers, and the lesson they were teaching was this: any species capable of threatening humanity was also capable of destroying everything else. Vorthak's ancient eyes surveyed the chamber, noting how his audience was finally beginning to grasp the true scope of what they faced. The humans did not want to rule the galaxy. They wanted to be left alone, but they were willing to destroy the galaxy if that was the only way to ensure their survival. And they demonstrated that they had both the capability and the resolve to do exactly that. The emergency session had been called because of intelligence reports suggesting that a minor species in the Outer Rim had made contact with human descendants. The implications were terrifying to anyone who understood the true history of the galaxy's most dangerous species. "This is why we established the Forbidden Zone," Vorthak explained. "This is why no ship is permitted to enter that region of space. This is why we tell the stories, even though most consider them ancient mythology. The humans did not disappear. They withdrew. There is a difference." Representative Morlack of the warrior clans, his species known for their martial prowess and aggressive nature, spoke with uncharacteristic humility. "What became of them, Elder? Where did they go?" "They returned to their original territory and sealed themselves away from the rest of the galaxy. For 12,000 cycles, they have remained in isolation, developing their civilization without external interference. And we have been very careful to ensure that no one disturbs that isolation." The weight of this revelation settled over the chamber like a shroud. The most powerful military force in galactic history had not been defeated or destroyed. It had simply chosen to remove itself from galactic affairs. And now, someone had potentially made contact with them. The species that contacted them is called the Kelthani. They are young, ambitious, and unfortunately, they have no knowledge of true galactic history. Their first contact protocols detected the human signals, and they responded with what they considered standard diplomatic overtures. The display showed intercepted communications between Kelthani ships and something in the Forbidden Zone. The human responses were polite, almost friendly, but to those who knew the signs, they carried undertones of barely contained warning. "What exactly did the Kelthani do?" asked Ambassador Esrel of the Trading Federation, her translator struggling with the fear frequencies in her native tongue. "They did what any young species might do when encountering a new civilization. They demanded proof of human technological capabilities. They insisted on formal diplomatic protocols. They suggested that humanity should apply for membership in the Galactic Council and submit to standard regulatory oversight." The silence that followed this statement was absolute. Every representative in the chamber understood the implications. A species that had once brought galactic civilization to its knees was being told to submit to bureaucratic oversight by a species that had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. "The humans have not responded aggressively," Vorthak continued, though his tone suggested this was not necessarily good news. "They have been patient, almost amused by the Kelthani demands, but our deep space monitors have detected something that fills me with terror." The holographic display changed to show long-range sensor readings from the edge of the Forbidden Zone. What the sensors had detected was impossible to miss: massive energy signatures indicating industrial activity on a scale that dwarfed anything in current galactic civilization. "They are building something," Vorthak said simply. "Something vast and powerful and completely beyond our understanding. Our best estimates suggest construction on a scale that would require the resources of entire star systems." Elder Thyron of the Science Casts analyzed the data with growing alarm. "These energy readings suggest industrial capacity that exceeds our own by several orders of magnitude. How is such a thing possible?" "Because," Vorthak replied, "while we have spent 12,000 cycles maintaining the status quo, trading with each other, and engaging in minor territorial disputes, the humans have spent 12,000 cycles preparing for the possibility that they might need to defend themselves again." The implications were staggering. 12 millennia of technological development, driven by a species that had already demonstrated their capability for systematic destruction, focused entirely on the problem of survival in a hostile galaxy. "What you see here," Vorthak gestured to the sensor readings, "is not just industrial capacity. This is the output of a civilization that has spent over 10,000 years asking themselves one question: how do we ensure that no one can ever threaten us again?" The chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives began to grasp the true scope of the situation. The humans had not been weakened by their isolation. They had been growing stronger, more capable, more dangerous with each passing year. And now, Vorthak concluded, the Kelthani have managed to anger them. The final piece of intelligence was the most disturbing of all. Recent communications intercepts suggested that human patience with Kelthani demands was beginning to wear thin. The polite, diplomatic responses were becoming shorter, more direct, and carried an edge that reminded those who knew history of the warnings that had preceded the last galactic conflict. What do we do? The question came from Representative Voss of the Peaceful Worlds, his crystalline form resonating with anxiety. Vorthak was quiet for a long moment, his ancient mind wrestling with possibilities that all led to the same terrible conclusion. We pray, he said finally, that the humans remember mercy, and we prepare for the possibility that they do not. The emergency session was adjourned with a single directive. All galactic assets were to be placed on highest alert, and every species was to begin immediate preparations for the possibility of another human war. Because if the Kelthani had truly managed to provoke humanity into action, the galaxy was about to learn whether the most dangerous species in known space had become more reasonable over the past 12,000 years. Or whether they had simply become more efficient. Admiral Kethvar of the Kelthani Exploration Fleet stood before the massive view screen of his flagship, watching the sensor readings with growing frustration. For 3 standard months, his fleet had been exchanging communications with the mysterious civilization in what the rest of the galaxy called the Forbidden Zone. What they had discovered defied everything the Kelthani thought they knew about space-faring civilizations. The humans, as they called themselves, possessed technology that seemed almost casual in its superiority. Their ships appeared on sensors as massive signatures that suggested vessels larger than Kelthani cities, yet they moved with a grace that defied physics as his people understood it. Their communication systems could reach across impossible distances instantaneously, and their industrial capacity appeared to dwarf that of entire galactic sectors. Yet despite all of this obvious technological superiority, the humans refused to provide proper documentation of their capabilities, declined to submit to standard diplomatic protocols, and showed what Kethvar considered an insulting lack of respect for Kelthani authority. Admiral, reported his sensor officer, we're receiving another transmission from the human vessel, same frequency as before. Put it through, Kethvar ordered, his crest feathers ruffling with irritation. And this time I want them to understand that the Kelthani Dominion does not accept evasive answers. The view screen flickered and showed the now familiar image of a human male. Captain Marcus Chen appeared to be middle-aged by human standards, with graying hair and lines around his eyes that suggested either wisdom or weariness. He wore a simple uniform with minimal decoration, which only added to Kethvar's frustration. How could such an obviously advanced civilization have such plain military dress? Admiral Kethvar, Captain Chen said politely, his voice carrying the same patient tone he had used in every previous communication. I trust your fleet as well. Captain Chen, Kethvar replied stiffly, I am not interested in pleasantries. For 3 months, I have been requesting proper documentation of your civilization's technological capabilities, military strength, and territorial claims. These are standard requirements for any species seeking recognition in this region of space. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been amusement. Admiral, I have explained our position repeatedly. Humanity does not seek recognition from external authorities. We require only that others respect our clearly marked territorial boundaries. And I have explained to you, Kethvar's voice rose slightly, that the Kelthani Dominion has legal salvage claims in this sector dating back 200 years. Your people cannot simply declare ownership of space that has already been claimed by others. Can we not? Chen asked quietly, and for just a moment, Kethvar caught something in the human's tone that made his combat instincts twitch with unease. Furthermore, Kethvar continued, pushing past the momentary discomfort, your refusal to demonstrate your technological capabilities is in direct violation of the non-aggression protocols established by the Regional Council. Any species possessing advanced military technology must provide transparent documentation to prevent miscalculations. Chen was silent for several seconds, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, still polite, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Admiral, are you requesting a demonstration of human military capabilities? I am demanding it, Kethvar replied firmly. The Kelthani Dominion has a right to know what we're dealing with. If your people possess weapons of mass destruction, if you have the capability to threaten established trade routes or civilian populations, we need to know the extent of that threat. The human captain studied Kethvar for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I see. Admiral, before I respond to your demand, I need to ask you a direct question. Are you aware of the historical significance of this region of space? What historical significance? Kethvar scoffed. This is empty space on the edge of civilized territory. The only significance it has is what my people choose to give it. Something changed in Captain Chen's expression. The polite mask didn't slip, but Kethvar suddenly had the distinct impression that he was no longer talking to a diplomat. He was talking to a soldier, and not just any soldier, a soldier who had seen combat and emerged victorious. Admiral, Chen said carefully, I strongly recommend that you consult with your government's historical archives before we continue this conversation. Look up the Galactic War of 12 millennia past. Look up the Scorched Galaxy Doctrine. Look up the Treaty of Isolation. I don't need to consult archives, Kethvar replied dismissively. I need to see proof that your people can back up their territorial claims with appropriate force. If you're not willing to provide that proof voluntarily, the Kelthani Dominion is prepared to conduct our own assessment. The silence that followed this statement stretched uncomfortably long. Captain Chen's expression remained perfectly controlled, but Kethvar noticed that the human had gone completely still in a way that reminded him of predators preparing to strike. Admiral, Chen said finally, his voice so quiet that the communication system had to amplify it. I want to make absolutely certain I understand what you're saying. Are you threatening to use military force against humanity? I am informing you, Kethvar replied, his own voice rising with authority, that the Kelthani Dominion has the right to defend its territorial claims and assess potential threats to regional security. If your people continue to refuse cooperation with standard protocols, we will be forced to take appropriate action. Chen nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. Admiral, I'm going to do something that hasn't been done in over 12,000 years. I'm going to grant your request for a demonstration. Before Kethvar could respond, his sensor officer called out in alarm. Admiral, I'm reading massive energy spikes from the human vessel. Whatever they're doing, the power levels are off our charts. On the view screen, Captain Chen touched a control on his command chair. Admiral Kethvar, you requested a demonstration of human capabilities. You are about to receive one. I suggest you record everything that happens next, so that your government will understand exactly what they're dealing with. The space around the human vessel began to shimmer, and Kethvar's instruments went wild as sensors detected energy patterns that shouldn't have been possible. The fabric of space itself seemed to bend and twist around the human ship, and then something appeared that made every Kelthani on the bridge gasp in shock. It wasn't another ship. It was a construct of some kind, massive beyond comprehension and clearly artificial. The object materialized out of what appeared to be folded space, its surface reflecting starlight in patterns that hurt to look at directly. As it stabilized, the sensors began to provide readings that made no sense. By the ancient fires, whispered the sensor officer. Admiral, that object is over 50 kilometers long. The mass readings suggest it's constructed from materials we don't even have classifications for. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part was that it was just the first one. More objects began appearing around the Kelthani fleet, not ships, but structures that defied easy categorization. Some appeared to be weapon platforms, their surfaces bristling with devices that radiated power signatures comparable to stellar phenomena. Others were clearly defensive installations, their hulls rippling with energy fields that made space itself seem unstable. Admiral, Captain Chen's voice cut through the chaos on the Kelthani bridge. What you are seeing is a small sample of humanity's defensive capabilities. These platforms represent approximately 0.001% of our total military assets. Kethvar stared at the readings, trying to process what he was seeing. If these massive structures represented such a tiny fraction of human capability, then the true scope of their civilization was beyond anything the Kelthani had ever imagined. How is this possible? He whispered, more to himself than to the human captain. 12,000 years, Chen replied, apparently having heard the question. 12,000 years of asking ourselves what we would need to survive another war like the last one. 12,000 years of building, preparing, and hopping we would never need to use what we created. The largest of the structures began to power up, and the energy readings spiked so high that the Kelthani sensors simply gave up trying to quantify them. Space around the platform began to glow with released energy, and Kethvar realized with growing horror that he was looking at a weapon capable of sterilizing entire star systems. "The platform you're looking at," Chen continued conversationally, "is what we call a star lance. It can precisely target any object within a radius of 50 light-years and deliver enough focused energy to crack a planet's core. We have 17,000 of them positioned around human space." 17,000. The number hit Kethvar like a physical blow. His entire fleet carried enough firepower to threaten individual worlds, but what he was looking at could destroy entire star systems. And there were 17,000 of them. "But that's just our defensive grid," Chen added. "Admiral, you demanded to know about our military capabilities. Would you like to see our offensive systems?" "No," Kethvar said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, that won't be necessary." "I think it is necessary," Chen replied, and his tone carried an edge that made it clear this was no longer a request. "You see, Admiral, when someone threatens humanity, we want them to understand exactly what they're threatening. We want them to make fully informed decisions." The defensive platforms began to move, arranging themselves in a formation that surrounded the Kelthani fleet. It wasn't an aggressive positioning. It was more like a demonstration of precision and control that was somehow more frightening than any direct threat could have been. "Each platform you see," Chen explained, "is operated by a human artificial intelligence that has been specifically designed for military applications. These AIs have been studying galactic warfare for 12,000 years, learning from every conflict, every tactic, every strategy ever employed by any species." More structures began to appear, these ones clearly different in design and purpose. They were sleeker, more organic-looking, and they moved with a fluid grace that suggested they were as much alive as they were mechanical. "Those are our biomechanical warfare systems," Chen continued. "Living ships that can adapt their capabilities in real time, repair themselves from damage, and reproduce if necessary. They're particularly effective against enemies that rely on traditional tactics." Kethvar's tactical officer provided a running commentary of sensor readings that grew more disturbing with each report. The biomechanical vessels weren't just ships. They were predators, designed to hunt and destroy other spacecraft with the same efficiency that biological predators used against their prey. "And finally," Chen said, his voice taking on a note of finality, "we have our specialized warfare platforms." The space around the demonstration area began to fold in on itself, and something emerged that made all the previous revelations pale in comparison. It wasn't a ship or a platform or even a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a piece of weaponized reality, a construct that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. "That," Chen explained, "is a reality manipulation platform. It can alter the fundamental constants of physics within a limited area, making certain types of matter or energy simply cease to exist. We developed it as a solution to enemies who might try to hide behind barriers we couldn't otherwise penetrate." The demonstration lasted exactly 15 minutes. In that time, Kethvar and his crew were shown technologies that redefined their understanding of what was possible. They saw weapons that could unravel matter at the subatomic level, defensive systems that could make entire fleets simply vanish from existence, and mobility systems that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than absolute rules. When it was over, when the platforms had folded back into whatever dimensional space they normally occupied, Captain Chen's face reappeared on the view screen. His expression was as polite and controlled as it had been at the beginning of the conversation. "Admiral Kethvar," Chen said, "you now have the demonstration you requested. I trust this satisfies your need to assess our capabilities." Kethvar could barely speak. His voice, when it finally emerged, was hoarse with shock. How many beings could you field in an actual conflict?" "That's not the right question, Admiral," Chen replied. "The right question is, how many do we need to field? And the answer is, it depends on how thoroughly we want our enemies to be defeated." The implications of that statement were clear. Humanity hadn't just built a military. They had built a force capable of varying the intensity of its response based on how completely they wanted to destroy their enemies. But Admiral, Chen continued, I want you to understand something important. Everything you just saw, all of this technology, all of this capability, it exists for one purpose only: to ensure that humanity never again faces the threat of extinction. We don't want to conquer anyone. We don't want to rule anyone. We just want to be left alone. Kethvar nodded numbly, finally beginning to understand the true nature of what his people had stumbled into. However, Chen's voice grew harder, when someone threatens us, when someone demands that we submit to their authority, when someone suggests that they have the right to dictate terms to us, well, that's when all of this technology becomes relevant to the conversation. The human captain leaned forward slightly, and for the first time since the demonstration began, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Admiral, I'm going to give you some advice. Go home. Report to your superiors exactly what you've seen here. Tell them that humanity appreciates their interest in our affairs, but that we have no intention of submitting to any external authority. And most importantly, tell them that any future attempts to force compliance will be met with responses proportional to the level of threat presented. Kethvar's training told him to respond with authority, to maintain the dignity of the Kelthani dominion, to refuse to be intimidated by threats. But his survival instincts, honed by millions of years of evolution, were screaming at him to retreat while he still could. I will convey your message to my government, he said finally. Good, Chen replied. And Admiral, when you make your report, please emphasize to your leaders that humanity has a very long memory. We remember every species that has threatened us. We remember every betrayal, every attack, every attempt to subjugate us. But we also remember those who chose wisdom over aggression. The communication ended, leaving the Kelthani fleet alone in space that suddenly felt much less empty than it had before. Kethvar stared at the view screen for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. His communications officer broke the silence. Admiral, should I prepare a message to command? Kethvar nodded slowly. Yes, priority Alpha transmission. Tell them we're coming home, and tell them we need to convene an emergency session of the Territorial Council. As his fleet began the long journey back to Kelthani space, Kethvar couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy. The humans weren't just another advanced species. They were something else entirely, something that had evolved beyond the normal patterns of galactic civilization. And judging by what he had seen, angering them would be the last mistake any species would ever make. The emergency session of the Kelthani Territorial Council had been in progress for 6 hours, and the atmosphere in the Grand Chamber grew more heated with each passing moment. Admiral Kethvar stood at the central podium, his recording of the human demonstration playing for the 5th time as council members struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. Chancellor Vexthal, the most senior member of the council and architect of Kelthani expansion policy, slammed his ceremonial staff against the floor. This is obviously some form of advanced holographic deception. No species could possibly possess such technological superiority without the rest of the galaxy being aware of it. With respect, Chancellor, Kethvar replied, his voice strained from hours of repetition. Our sensor logs confirm that everything we witnessed was completely real. The energy signatures, the gravitational distortions, the quantum field manipulations, all of it registered on our instruments exactly as you would expect from genuine technology. Council member Jaranes, representing the military caste, studied the tactical data with professional interest. Even accepting that this display was genuine, Admiral, these humans showed you defensive platforms, static installations designed to protect their territory. That tells us nothing about their ability to project force beyond their borders. Council member, Kethvar said carefully, I believe you may be misunderstanding the nature of what we encountered. These humans weren't showing us their defenses. They were giving us a demonstration of their restraint. The council chamber erupted in indignant chittering as several members vocalized their displeasure with what they perceived as defeatist thinking. Chancellor Vexthal's crest feathers flushed deep red with anger. Admiral Kethvar, you were sent to assess a potential territorial dispute, not to surrender Kelthani sovereignty to the first species that managed to impress you with fancy light shows. Chancellor, Kethvar's voice carried an edge of frustration. With respect, I don't think you understand the scale of what we're dealing with. The humans told us that what we saw represented 1/10,000th of 1% of their total capabilities. If that's true, then their civilization possesses more military power than the rest of the galaxy combined. Impossible exaggerations designed to intimidate us, scoffed council member Proctor from the commercial guilds. No species can maintain such massive military expenditures without crippling their economy. These humans are clearly bluffing. They're not bluffing, said a new voice from the chamber's entrance. Every head turned to see Elder Corvash entering the chamber, his ancient frame moving with the careful dignity of extreme age. The eldest member of the Kelthani species, Corvash rarely participated in council sessions anymore, preferring to spend his time in the historical archives. Elder, Chancellor Vexthal said with carefully controlled irritation, "While we respect your wisdom, this is a closed emergency session dealing with matters of immediate territorial security." "Child," Corvash replied, his voice carrying the authority of centuries, "I have been reviewing the historical archives since Admiral Kethvar's initial report reached our homeworld. I suggest you listen very carefully to what I have discovered." The chamber fell silent. Elder Corvash was known for his meticulous research and perfect memory. If he claimed to have found something relevant in the archives, it was worth hearing. "The region of space you have been exploring," Corvash continued, "has not always been empty. 12,000 years ago, it was the center of the most devastating war in recorded galactic history. A war that ended galactic civilization as it existed at that time and reshaped the political structure of our entire arm of the galaxy." "Elder," interrupted Council Member Jaranes, "surely you're not suggesting that these humans are connected to events from 12 millennia ago. That's longer than recorded Kelthani history." "Not connected to those events," Corvash replied calmly. "They were those events. The humans are not a recently discovered species, Council members. They are the species that the ancient texts refer to as the Galaxy Killers." The chamber erupted in chaos. Several council members began speaking at once, their voices rising in pitch and volume as they tried to process this revelation. Chancellor Vexthal's feathers had gone completely pale, a sign of extreme shock in Kelthani physiology. "That's impossible," Proctor said, his commercial instincts rejecting anything that didn't fit his understanding of galactic economics. "The Galaxy Killers are mythology, stories told to frighten young spacers." "Mythology?" Corvash's voice carried centuries of accumulated scorn. "I have spent the past week reviewing primary source documents from the archives of 17 different species. Documents that were sealed away because the information they contained was considered too dangerous for general knowledge." The Elder activated a holographic display that showed star charts dating back 12,000 years. The maps displayed a galaxy that looked very different from the current political structure, with trade routes and territorial boundaries that no longer existed. "This," Corvash said, indicating a large region in what was now called the Forbidden Zone, "was the territory of the Terran Federation, the human civilization that existed before the war. They controlled approximately 300 star systems and maintained peaceful relations with most of their neighbors." The display shifted to show the progression of the war, with different colors indicating the expansion and contraction of various military forces. What became immediately clear was that the humans had not started the conflict as aggressors. They had been responding to a coordinated attack by a coalition of other species. "The war began," Corvash explained, "when a coalition of 17 species decided that human technology posed a potential threat to galactic stability. They assembled the largest military force in recorded history and moved to eliminate humanity as a preventive measure." Council member Jaranes studied the tactical displays with professional interest. What was the outcome of this preemptive strike? "Total disaster," Corvash replied simply. "The humans not only defeated the coalition forces, they systematically dismantled the infrastructure that supported galactic civilization. Trade routes, communication networks, orbital habitats, industrial centers, everything that connected the galaxy was targeted for destruction." The display showed the systematic collapse of interstellar civilization, with entire sectors going dark as human forces eliminated the technology that held them together. What was most disturbing was the methodical nature of the destruction. This had not been random violence, but calculated warfare designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. "But why?" asked Council Member Thyranus from the agricultural guilds. If they had defeated their enemies, why continue destroying civilian infrastructure? Because, Corvash said gravely, the humans had learned something that no other species had ever understood. They realized that any civilization capable of organizing an attack on humanity would always remain a potential threat. So they decided to eliminate the possibility of organized galactic civilization entirely. The implications of this strategy were staggering. The humans hadn't just wanted to win a war, they had wanted to ensure that no future war of the same scale would ever be possible. The Scorched Galaxy Doctrine, Admiral Kethvar said quietly. Captain Chen mentioned it during our communication. Exactly, Corvash confirmed. The humans developed a systematic plan to reduce galactic civilization to a level where no species would be capable of threatening them again. They began dismantling the foundations of interstellar society itself. Chancellor Vexthal had been silent during this explanation, but now he spoke with a voice that carried barely controlled panic. Elder, are you telling us that these humans are the same species that nearly destroyed galactic civilization 12,000 years ago? Not the same individuals, obviously, Corvash replied. But yes, the same species, the same culture, and apparently the same strategic philosophy. And according to Admiral Kethvar's report, they have spent 12,000 years improving their capabilities. The chamber fell silent as the full scope of the situation became clear. The Kelthani Dominion hadn't stumbled across a newly discovered species with advanced technology. They had awakened the most dangerous military force in galactic history. What stopped them before? Gerenes asked. How was the war finally ended? It wasn't ended by military force, Corvash explained. It was ended by negotiation, but not the kind of negotiation you might expect. The surviving galactic governments essentially agreed to humanity's terms for cessation of hostilities. What terms? Chancellor Vexthal asked, though his expression suggested he already feared the answer. Complete isolation. Humanity would withdraw to their original territory and seal themselves away from the rest of the galaxy. In return, they would cease their campaign of systematic destruction. But there was one additional condition. Corvash paused, his ancient eyes meeting each council member in turn. No galactic government would ever again attempt to exercise authority over humanity. Any species that violated this agreement would face the full implementation of the Scorched Galaxy Doctrine, with no possibility of negotiation or surrender. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the soft humming of the chamber's environmental systems. Every council member was beginning to understand the true magnitude of their situation. Elder, Admiral Kethvar said slowly, when I demanded that the humans submit to Kelthani authority, when I insisted they provide documentation for galactic oversight, was I violating this ancient treaty? Yes, Corvash replied simply. And based on the historical records, humanity's response to your demands was remarkably restrained. Council member Plokter's commercial instincts finally grasped the economic implications. If these humans possess the technological capabilities they demonstrated, combined with 12,000 years of development time, what could they do to galactic civilization if they chose to resume their previous campaign? Corvash was quiet for a long moment, consulting data files that most species had forgotten existed. Based on their demonstrated capabilities 12,000 years ago, and extrapolating for technological advancement over the intervening period, they could probably dismantle current galactic civilization in approximately 6 months. But that assumes they would choose to do so gradually. And if they didn't choose to do so gradually, Chancellor Vexthal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Based on the demonstrations Admiral Kethvar witnessed, they could probably accomplish the same result in 6 days. The mathematical precision of potential destruction was somehow more terrifying than any emotional threat could have been. The humans weren't driven by anger or hatred. They were driven by strategic necessity and supported by technological capabilities that rendered conventional military thinking obsolete. What do we do? Thyranus asked, her voice reflecting the fear that was spreading through the chamber. We hope, Corvash replied, that humanity chooses to maintain their policy of isolation rather than treating Kelthani territorial claims as a resumption of galactic aggression against them. And if they don't, Gerenes pressed, Then we learn whether the galaxy has any more species willing to commit suicide by challenging the most dangerous civilization in recorded history, Corvash said matter-of-factly. Chancellor Vexthal stood slowly, his political instincts finally grasping the true scope of the crisis. Elder, based on your research, what would you recommend as our appropriate response to this situation? Immediate and complete withdrawal from all territorial claims in human space, Corvash replied without hesitation. Formal acknowledgement of human sovereignty over their declared territory, and most importantly, a clear message to all Kelthani forces that any future contact with humanity must be approached with extreme caution and respect. That sounds like surrender, Plochter objected. It is surrender, Corvash agreed. The same intelligent surrender that allowed galactic civilization to survive 12,000 years ago. The alternative is the systematic destruction of everything we have built. Admiral Kethvar looked around the chamber at his fellow council members, seeing his own fears reflected in their expressions. There's something else, he said quietly. During our communication, Captain Chen mentioned that humanity has a long memory. He specifically said they remember every species that has threatened them. What does that mean? Vexthal asked. I think it means, Kethvar replied, that from this moment forward humanity will be watching us, evaluating whether the Kelthani Dominion represents a potential threat to their security, and if we make the wrong choice. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the chamber understood the implications. Elder Corvash moved to the central display, calling up a real-time star chart that showed current galactic political boundaries. With a few manipulations, he highlighted the region known as the Forbidden Zone, the space that had been off-limits to galactic traffic for 12 millennia. Council members, he said solemnly, you now understand why this region was designated as forbidden territory. You understand why the ancient treaties exist, and you understand what will happen if we choose to ignore those treaties. The star chart showed the Kelthani Dominion's territory in relation to human space. Even with their recent expansion, Kelthani holdings were dwarfed by the vast region that humanity controlled. More importantly, human territory was positioned in such a way that they could easily cut the major trade routes that connected Kelthani space to the rest of the galaxy. We are completely at their mercy, Jarani said, her military training allowing her to quickly assess the strategic situation. Even if we mobilized our entire fleet, even if we somehow managed to inflict casualties on them, they could simply cut us off from galactic civilization and wait for our economy to collapse. Worse than that, Corvash added. According to the historical records, when humanity implements the Scorched Galaxy doctrine, they don't just target military assets. They systematically eliminate everything that makes interstellar civilization possible. Power generation, communication networks, transportation infrastructure, industrial capacity, everything. Chancellor Vexthal sat heavily in his ceremonial chair, the weight of leadership suddenly feeling unbearable. How long do we have to make our decision? Unknown, Admiral Kethvar replied. Captain Chen didn't provide any specific timeline, but he did make it clear that humanity expects a response to their message. The message had been simple but unmistakable. Respect human sovereignty or face the consequences. The only question now was whether the Kelthani Dominion was wise enough to choose survival over pride. I call for an immediate vote, Chancellor Vexthal announced. All in favor of complete withdrawal from disputed territory in human space and formal recognition of their sovereignty. The vote was unanimous. Even the most aggressive members of the Council understood that some fights could not be won through force of arms. As the session concluded and Council members began to file out of the chamber, Elder Corvash remained behind, staring at the display showing human territory. Admiral Kethvar approached him, drawn by the ancient being's obvious contemplation. Elder, Kethvar said quietly, do you think they'll accept our withdrawal as sufficient? Corvash was quiet for a long moment. I think, he said finally, that depends on whether they believe we've learned the lesson they were trying to teach. And if they don't believe we've learned, then we discover whether galactic civilization can survive a second encounter with humanity's interpretation of necessary force. As they left the chamber, neither of them noticed the small device hidden in the decorative artwork. A device that had been recording every word of their emergency session, and transmitting the data across impossible distances to observers who had been waiting 12,000 years for exactly this kind of conversation. Captain Marcus Chen stood before the Strategic Assessment Council in the deepest level of Citadel Station, humanity's primary command center hidden within the gravitational anomaly of a collapsed star. The chamber itself defied conventional physics, existing in a pocket of folded spacetime that allowed it to be simultaneously larger than the station that contained it and completely invisible to external sensors. The 12 members of the council represented the collective leadership of human civilization, though their individual areas of responsibility had evolved far beyond anything that previous generations would have recognized. These were not politicians or military commanders in any traditional sense. They were the architects of humanity's survival strategy, beings who had dedicated their lives to ensuring that their species would never again face the threat of extinction. Director Sarah Voss, the Council's primary strategic coordinator, reviewed the data streams flowing from thousands of monitoring stations positioned throughout the galaxy. Marcus, your handling of the Kelthani situation appears to have achieved the desired initial response. They've formally withdrawn their territorial claims and issued a galaxy-wide advisory warning other species to avoid our space. That was the easy part, Chen replied. Young species usually respond appropriately when they understand what they're dealing with. The concern is whether this incident will trigger a broader galactic response. Dr. Elena Vasquez, responsible for xenological analysis, brought up holographic displays showing communication intercepts from across the galaxy. We're already seeing increased chatter among the established civilizations. The Galactic Council has called an emergency session, and several military alliances are conducting routine exercises suspiciously close to our borders. Expected, commented Director James Park, whose specialty was long-term strategic planning. The question is whether they're taking defensive measures or preparing for another coordinated attack. Chen studied the intelligence reports with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades analyzing alien behavior patterns. Based on my interaction with Admiral Kethvar and our monitoring of their internal communications, I believe the Kelthani leadership genuinely understands the situation. They're not the problem. The problem, added Director Lisa Wang from her position at the Xenopsychological Analysis Station, is that their public withdrawal and warnings have reminded the entire galaxy that humanity still exists. For 12,000 years, most species have treated us as ancient history. Now they're being forced to remember that we're still here. The implications of renewed galactic awareness were sobering. Humanity's strategy had always depended on being forgotten, on allowing other species to believe that the threats of the past were no longer relevant to contemporary politics. The Kelthani incident had shattered that comfortable illusion. Admiral Rebecca Torres, the Council's military representative, brought up tactical displays showing the current disposition of human forces. Our monitoring networks are detecting increased surveillance activity along all border regions. Nothing aggressive yet, but several species are clearly attempting to assess our current capabilities. Let them look, said Dr. Michael Harrison, whose responsibility was technological development. Our sensor screens will show them exactly what we want them to see. The question is whether we want to appear weak to encourage aggression or strong to discourage it. Director Voss considered the strategic implications. Marcus, based on your assessment of galactic political dynamics, how do you think the established powers will respond to confirmation that humanity remains active? Chen was quiet for a moment, drawing on decades of experience in analyzing alien civilizations. There are 3 likely scenarios, he said finally. The first is that they'll choose to maintain the status quo, avoid our territory, respect our sovereignty, and hope we continue our policy of isolation. Probability, asked Director Park. Approximately 30%. Too many species have territorial ambitions that conflict with indefinite human expansion restrictions. Second scenario, they'll attempt to contain us through diplomatic means. Economic isolation, trade restrictions, formal treaties designed to limit our territorial expansion. Essentially trying to turn our self-imposed isolation into an externally enforced prison. Director Vasquez analyzed the communication intercepts with growing concern. That approach is consistent with what we're seeing from the established trading coalitions. They're already discussing protective measures to safeguard galactic commerce. Probability of success for diplomatic containment, Director Wang asked. 0, Chen replied simply. We're not dependent on galactic trade, and we have no interest in territorial expansion beyond our current boundaries. They can't restrict something we don't want. Admiral Torres leaned forward with professional interest. And the third scenario. Direct military action. A coordinated attack designed to eliminate the human threat once and for all. The chamber fell silent as the council members contemplated this possibility. It was the scenario they had been preparing for since the end of the last Galactic War, the possibility that had driven 12,000 years of technological development and strategic planning. Probability, Director Voss asked. 65%, Chen said grimly. Fear is a powerful motivator, and the galaxy's established powers have more to lose now than they did 12,000 years ago. They've built an interconnected civilization that depends on stable trade routes and predictable political structures. Our mere existence threatens that stability. Dr. Harrison called up displays showing humanity's technological advancement over the past 12 millennia. If they do choose military action, they'll find us considerably more prepared than their predecessors were. The displays showed technological capabilities that made the demonstration given to Admiral Kethvar look like children's toys. Weapons that could restructure matter at the quantum level, defensive systems that operated outside normal space-time, and mobility platforms that treated galactic distances as minor inconveniences. The concern, Director Park noted, is not whether we can defend ourselves. The concern is whether we can do so without implementing full scorched galaxy protocols. This was the heart of humanity's strategic dilemma. They possessed the capability to end galactic civilization entirely, but doing so would leave them alone in a dead galaxy, a victory so complete that it became a form of defeat. Director Wang brought up psychological profiles of the galaxy's major political leaders. The current generation of galactic leadership has no direct experience with human military capability. They know the historical records, but they don't truly understand what those records mean in practical terms. Dangerous, Admiral Torres observed. Leaders who don't understand the consequences of their actions are likely to make catastrophic mistakes. Chen nodded grimly. That's exactly what I saw in Admiral Kethvar's initial approach. He was treating us like just another advanced species that could be managed through standard diplomatic pressure. It never occurred to him that he was poking something that could unmake his entire civilization. Dr. Vasquez highlighted communication intercepts from the Galactic Council's emergency session. The problem is that Kethvar's experience, while sobering to the Kelthani, is being interpreted differently by other species. Some see it as evidence that humanity can be managed through appropriate respect and caution. Others see it as proof that we're still a threat that needs to be eliminated. Which faction is stronger? Director Voss asked. Currently, the cautious approach has majority support, Vasquez replied. But that could change rapidly if any incident occurs that suggests human aggression. Define incident, Director Park said. Anything that could be interpreted as human expansion beyond our declared territory. Any use of our technology that affects non-human systems. Any response to galactic surveillance that appears disproportionate to the perceived threat. The council members exchanged glances that reflected their shared understanding of the impossible position they faced. Too aggressive a response would trigger the galactic war they were trying to avoid. Too passive a response would encourage the kind of testing that could escalate into the same conflict. Dr. Harrison brought up analysis of current galactic military capabilities. From a purely technological standpoint, the combined military forces of all current galactic civilizations represent approximately the same threat level as the coalition we faced 12,000 years ago. Meaning, Admiral Torres asked. Meaning that if they coordinate their attack effectively, they could potentially inflict casualties on our outer defensive perimeters before we fully implement our response protocols. This was a sobering assessment. 12,000 years of galactic technological development had made potential enemies more dangerous, even though humanity's own advancement had vastly outpaced anything the rest of the galaxy had achieved. Director Voss called up strategic analysis showing multiple attack scenarios. The critical factor is early warning. If we detect coordinated military preparation early enough, We can implement graduated response protocols designed to demonstrate our capabilities without immediately escalating to full warfare. And if we don't get early warning, Chen asked. Then we face the same choice our predecessors faced, Admiral Torres replied. Total victory or total defeat with no middle ground possible. Dr. Wang highlighted psychological profiles showing the mindset of current galactic leadership. There's another factor we need to consider. The current generation of leaders has lived their entire lives in a galaxy where humanity was absent. They've developed political and economic systems that assume human non-interference. Our renewed presence disrupts fundamental assumptions about how galactic civilization operates. Meaning they may attack us not because they want to, but because they can't conceive of any other response to our existence, Director Park concluded. Exactly. And that kind of attack, driven by institutional necessity rather than rational calculation, is almost impossible to deter through demonstrations of superior capability. Chen stood and moved to the central display, studying real-time intelligence reports from across the galaxy. There's something else we need to consider. The Kelthani incident has reminded everyone that the ancient treaties still exist. Some species may decide to test those treaties to see if we're still committed to enforcing them. What kind of testing? Director Voss asked. Territorial incursions into the Forbidden Zone, attempts to establish monitoring stations near our borders, demands for formal diplomatic recognition that would require us to participate in galactic political processes. Dr. Vasquez brought up analysis of recent galactic communication patterns. We're already seeing some of that. 3 different species have announced scientific expeditions that would take them through regions we've declared off-limits. 2 others have formally requested permission to establish research stations in systems we control. Responses? Admiral Torres asked. Polite refusals so far, Chen replied. But each refusal is being interpreted as either evidence of human weakness or confirmation of human isolation. Either interpretation encourages further testing. The Council faced a strategic problem that had no perfect solution. Every action they took, or failed to take, provided information to potential enemies while potentially creating the conditions for the conflict they were trying to prevent. Director Voss made the decision that would determine humanity's approach to the crisis. Marcus, I want you to prepare a comprehensive assessment of our current strategic position. Full analysis of galactic military capabilities, political dynamics, and potential response scenarios. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we decide how to proceed. Time frame, Chen asked. 72 hours. The galactic situation is evolving too rapidly for longer-term analysis to remain accurate. As the Council members began to file out of the chamber, Dr. Harrison remained behind to discuss technological concerns with Admiral Torres. Rebecca, if this escalates to active conflict, how confident are we in our ability to control the scope of our response? Torres considered the question with the careful precision of someone whose decisions could determine the fate of galactic civilization. Our technological capabilities have advanced far beyond what we demonstrated to the Kelthani. We could probably achieve any level of destruction we choose, from limited tactical strikes to complete galactic sterilization. That doesn't answer my question. The technology isn't the problem, Torres replied. The problem is whether we can maintain the political will to limit our response once shooting starts. 12,000 years of preparation for total war doesn't easily shift into limited engagement. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid you'd say. As they left the chamber, neither of them noticed the subtle changes in the quantum field generators that surrounded Citadel Station. Deep in the station's core, ancient artificial intelligences were beginning to activate protocols that had remained dormant for 12 millennia, preparing for possibilities that no one wanted to consider, but everyone had to plan for. The galaxy was about to discover whether humanity had become more reasonable over the past 12,000 years, or simply more efficient at implementing their interpretation of necessary force. And based on the initial intelligence reports, the answer to that question would determine whether galactic civilization survived the next few months. The galaxy's end came not with the thunder of 1,000 fleets, but with the quiet precision of a species that had spent 12,000 years perfecting the art of controlled destruction. Captain Marcus Chen stood in the observation deck of the UES Inevitability. watching through enhanced sensors as the last organized resistance crumbled in the distant Corvan system. It had taken exactly 18 days. 18 days from the moment the Galactic Alliance launched their preemptive peacekeeping operation against human space to the complete collapse of interstellar civilization as a functional entity. Not because humanity had wanted it that way, but because once again, the galaxy had chosen to learn its lessons the hard way. "Final casualty reports, Captain," reported his tactical officer, Lieutenant Sarah Kim. Her voice carried the weary professionalism of someone who had witnessed the systematic dismantling of a 1,000-year-old galactic order. "Military losses?" Chen asked, though he already knew the numbers. Every human commander did. They were updated in real time across the entire fleet. "Coalition forces, approximately 47 million beings across 832 ship classes. Human losses, 0 confirmed casualties, minor damage to 17 outer perimeter platforms." The disparity wasn't surprising. What was surprising was how little satisfaction Chen felt in hearing it. 12,000 years of preparation had made human victory inevitable, but it hadn't made it meaningful. Civilian displacement. Harder to calculate accurately. Estimated 200 billion beings evacuated from affected systems. Most evacuation programs were completed successfully before our forces arrived. That at least provided some comfort. Unlike their predecessors 12 millennia ago, the current generation of humans had no interest in civilian casualties. Their targets had been purely military and infrastructure-focused, designed to end the war quickly rather than inflict maximum suffering. "Sir," Kim continued, "we're receiving communication requests from approximately 400 different government entities. They all appear to be surrender offers." Chen sighed, a sound that carried the weight of inevitability. "Route them to Central Command. Command authority will determine which governments still exist in any meaningful sense." The problem with fighting a war against galactic civilization was that winning it left you responsible for the consequences. And the consequences of this particular victory were staggering in scope. Dr. Elena Vasquez's voice crackled over the communication system from her position aboard the command vessel UES Long Memory. "Marcus, we're getting reports from the outer monitoring stations. The cascade effects are spreading faster than our models predicted." "Define cascade effects," Chen replied, though he suspected he already knew. "Economic collapse in systems we never directly targeted. Trade routes shutting down because the regulatory structures that supported them no longer exist. Industrial centers going offline because they can't get the resources they need to maintain production." It was exactly what had happened 12,000 years ago, and exactly what human strategists had hoped to avoid this time. But hope, as Chen was learning, was a poor substitute for the laws of economic and political physics. How many systems are affected so far? Direct military action impacted approximately 300 systems. Secondary economic effects have reached an estimated 2,000 systems, and the count is rising as more regions lose connectivity to the galactic trade network. Chen closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. Humanity had struck precisely, targeting only military assets and critical infrastructure nodes. They had avoided population centers, preserved essential services, and provided advance warning for civilian evacuations. They had done everything possible to minimize collateral damage. And it hadn't mattered. "Dr. Vasquez, in your professional assessment, how long before the economic collapse stabilizes?" The pause before her answer told Chen everything he needed to know. "Conservative estimate, 50 to 75 years for basic interstellar trade to resume. Optimistic estimate, maybe 30 years if we provide significant assistance in rebuilding key infrastructure." 30 to 75 years. An entire generation would grow up in a galaxy where interstellar civilization existed only as a memory. All because the galaxy's leaders had decided that humanity represented an unacceptable threat to their established order. Admiral Rebecca Torr's voice joined the conversation from the UES final argument. "Marcus, we need to make some immediate decisions about ongoing operations. We've achieved all primary objectives, but the secondary effects are creating situations we didn't anticipate." "What kind of situations?" "Refugee crises in systems that aren't directly affected but can't support sudden population influxes. Resource shortages in regions that depended on the trade networks we've disrupted. And most seriously, several species are facing genuine extinction threats because their homeworlds can't sustain their populations without technological support we've eliminated. This was the nightmare scenario human planners had tried to avoid. Victory so complete that it became indistinguishable from universal catastrophe. Recommendations, Chen asked. We need to shift from warfare to crisis management, Tors replied, which means abandoning our policy of non-interference and taking direct responsibility for galactic stability. The implications were staggering. For 12,000 years, humanity had maintained its policy of isolation specifically to avoid this kind of responsibility. Now they faced the choice between allowing galactic civilization to collapse entirely or accepting the burden of ruling a galaxy they had never wanted to control. Captain, Lieutenant Kim reported, we're receiving a priority transmission from Citadel Command. Director Voss wants to speak with all senior field commanders immediately. The conference that followed included every human military leader currently engaged in operations across the galaxy. 12 individuals whose decisions over the past 18 days had reshaped the political structure of known space. Director Sarah Voss appeared on the main screen, her expression reflecting the weight of decisions that no human leader had wanted to make. Commanders, I'll be direct. The Strategic Assessment Council has reached a conclusion about our current situation, and none of you are going to like it. With respect, Director, said Captain Jennifer Walsh from the UES Necessary Truth, I think we can all see where this is heading. Perhaps, but you need to hear it officially. As of 1800 hours, standard human time, the Human Federation is formally abandoning its policy of galactic non-interference. The silence that followed this announcement spoke volumes about how the field commanders felt about their new responsibilities. Furthermore, Voss continued, we are implementing Emergency Protocol 7, Humanitarian Intervention and Stabilization Operations. All military assets will be reassigned to civilian protection, infrastructure restoration, and economic stabilization missions. Captain David Park from the UES Measured Response voiced what everyone was thinking. Director, with respect, we're not equipped for this kind of operation. We're a military force designed for precision warfare, not galactic governance. I understand your concerns, Voss replied. But we're faced with a choice between accepting responsibility for the consequences of our actions or allowing billions of innocent beings to suffer because their governments chose to attack us. Chen found himself speaking before he had fully processed his thoughts. Director, there's another consideration. If we assume responsibility for galactic stabilization, we become exactly what the Coalition claimed we were, a species that dominates others through superior force. That's a philosophical concern, Marcus. Right now, I'm more worried about the practical reality that approximately 40% of galactic civilization is facing immediate humanitarian crises. Dr. Vasquez provided additional context from her analysis stations. The situation is more complex than simple humanitarian intervention. Many of the governments that attacked us are already reforming, and they're requesting human assistance in rebuilding. We're not imposing our authority, we're being asked to provide it. This was perhaps the most disturbing development of all. The same species that had launched a coordinated attack to eliminate humanity were now begging for human help in dealing with the consequences of their own actions. Admiral Tors brought up the military implications. If we accept this responsibility, we're committing to a permanent presence across galactic space. That's exactly the kind of expansion that triggered this war in the first place. The difference, Voss pointed out, is that this time we're not expanding for our own benefit. We're expanding to clean up the mess that others created by attacking us. Lieutenant Kim flagged an incoming priority message. Captain, we're receiving a transmission from Elder Vorthak of the Galactic Council. He's requesting permission to address the human command structure. Chen had heard that name in the historical records. Vorthak had been one of the few voices advocating restraint during the current crisis, warning other species about the consequences of challenging humanity. Put him through, Chen ordered. The ancient being who appeared on screen looked even older than his recorded age suggested. His multiple eyes carried the weight of having witnessed 2 galactic wars, and the exhausted wisdom of someone who had tried repeatedly to prevent exactly this outcome. "Human commanders," Vorthak said, his voice carrying across impossible distances. "I speak for what remains of the Galactic Council, though I admit that title has little meaning after recent events." "Elder Vorthak," Chen replied formally, "you have our attention. I have a request that will sound strange coming from someone whose civilization you just defeated. I am asking you not to abandon us." The request hung in the silence of the communication channel, carrying implications that no one wanted to examine too closely. "You warned us," Vorthak continued. 12,000 years ago, your people told us exactly what would happen if we chose aggression over wisdom. We chose to forget those warnings. Our children chose to ignore them entirely, and now we face the consequences of that collective failure. Chen found himself responding with surprising gentleness. "Elder, humanity has no desire to rule the galaxy. We never did." "I understand that, Captain, but desire is irrelevant now. The simple reality is that you are the only force capable of preventing the complete collapse of interstellar civilization. Whether you want that responsibility or not, it has fallen to you." The conversation that followed covered ground that human philosophers had been exploring for 12 millennia. The obligations that superior capability created, the responsibility that came with the power to help or harm, the price of isolation in an interconnected universe. In the end, the decision was made not by grand philosophical reasoning, but by simple mathematics. The human industrial capacity could restore galactic infrastructure in decades rather than centuries. Human medical technology could prevent the famines and plagues that would otherwise claim billions of lives. Human organizational capability could coordinate relief efforts across thousands of star systems simultaneously. They had the power to help, and therefore the obligation to do so. "Very well," Director Voss announced to the assembled commanders. "Operation Galactic Recovery is authorized. All human assets will be deployed for humanitarian and reconstruction missions. Command structure will be reorganized to support long-term stability operations." "What about our isolation policy?" Captain Walsh asked. "Suspended indefinitely," Voss replied. "We tried isolation, the galaxy wouldn't let us keep it." As the conference ended, and commanders began the complex task of shifting from warfare to governance, Chen remained in the observation deck of his ship, watching the stars and thinking about the path that had brought humanity to this point. They had wanted nothing more than to be left alone. They had retreated to the edges of known space, sealed themselves away from galactic politics, and spent 12,000 years hoping that the rest of the galaxy would simply forget they existed. Instead, they had become the reluctant guardians of a civilization that couldn't seem to learn from its own history. The irony was not lost on him. Humanity's greatest strength, their ability to